Hi, I'm Malcolm West, and in this Project in a Box webinar session we're going to have a look through some key factors about what works well and what helps you in buying a PPM solution. Based on some discussions I was having with some colleagues as part of an APMG webinar we recently delivered, where we were talking about PPM solutions and some of the ideas that came up about what really helps you in your buying process and to understand and make sure you buy the right thing, and what doesn't help you very much, and some of our own thoughts as well, just all thrown in the pot really. So what you need to have is sufficient maturity, support and time. How much is enough? Well, that depends entirely on you as an organisation. There is no magic formula here, but you have to think about these aspects when you are making your buying decisions. And you also have to have the right approach. So we're going to look at 4 factors in here. So the first one is maturity. If you don't really understand about project management maturity, program portfolio maturities, then we've got some other videos around this, but it's about understanding whether you're new to it or whether you're very experienced and you've got all your processes set up. That's basically the idea. And if you don't have very much in the way of maturity, then you need to have a system which is going to match that quite well. It's going to be something that you can adopt easily and is going to do the same sorts of things that you do. A system for a mature organisation needs to do the same sorts of things that a mature organisation will do. And so you have to match those things. It's very much like buying children's shoes. If you buy the wrong sort of shoes for the child at the wrong age or the wrong type of shoes, then that's not going to work very well. It's also not going to work very well to buy a shoe that fits exactly when the child is growing. So if you're at a low maturity level, you need to be looking at a tool which is appropriate for you, but gives you some growth room, and you need to think about the direction in which you might want to grow and look for a tool that's going to match you there. So thinking very clearly about your maturity. Then we're going to talk about support. So often when people buy tools, they are bought by senior management, and senior management clearly need to be bought into the decision, but you also need to have bought into the decision the people that are actually going to use the tool on a day-to-day basis for managing their projects or inputting data. So management often thinks about reporting, metrics, data processing, control spans, being able to understand the finances and risks and issues of a project, etc. And that's great, and they certainly need that, and they need to be bought into it, and the tool needs to deliver the maturity of that information that they need. That's definitely the case. But if it's just a data gathering exercise and the project teams and project managers are just feeding in numbers, they're going to see it as an extra activity. It's nothing that's giving any value to them. They're not going to be particularly keen on doing it. It's going to build resentment. It's going to be difficult to implement. It's not going to be exactly what everybody had in mind. If, however, it also supports the needs of the day-to-day project managers, things like communications, documentation management, process, managing the day-to-day activities of work packages and all the information around that, which management are not fantastically interested in as long as it's delivering financially and hitting its timescales. They're not interested in the nitty-gritty, but the nitty-gritty is very important to the people at the lower level. So really, for a system to be successful, you have to have support across its stakeholder groups. I pick out 2 here, management and the people at the coalface, but in practice there are many more stakeholder groups than that, and so you need to understand who's going to be using it, interacting with it, and is it going to meet the things that they need. And then time is very important. You can have a system and try and implement it, and you want it to be working the next day. In practice that's very unlikely. Bigger changes take longer to implement. That's always the case, and this is a change process. It needs change management to some degree. People are going from doing one thing to doing another, and it can't just happen overnight. Perhaps with a lot of pre-thought and training you can slicken that process up and make it more likely to happen, but it is quite a fundamental change, and therefore the best way of achieving that is to run some sort of pilot. So you would try it out on a small set of projects with a small group of users who would be quite heavily trained. They would come out of that experience and you'd refine your understanding and apply that to the next group and go on, etc. And you'd roll a system out slowly, and then you're going to get a much better experience. It's going to take longer. You get a better result though at the end of that process, and of course, as I say, the more significant change you make, the longer it's going to take to do. So you very much need to think about that. It's no good buying something and expecting it to work the next day, because it really isn't going to happen. And so the right approach is the last point I wanted to make. And this is something we see people making mistakes around quite often, actually. What often happens is somebody says we need a tool, and they get a load of people in that are interested, and they write down a list. Everyone says, well, I want it to do these 10 things. Somebody else says, I want it to do these 20 things. And you build up a long list, and people then go out to potential suppliers with that long list. That's a real problem when that happens, and it happens far too often, because you're then narrowing down your choice to very big complex tools which have a massive functionality set, and there might be one person who's put a particular requirement down, and that limits the tools that you can buy. And you're satisfying everybody's needs potentially, but you will end up with a very big complex system which is very expensive and very difficult to implement, because it's going to take a long period of time. There's going to be lots of training. Certain people are only going to be using certain parts of it. It's very much not an 80-20 approach, and a really good approach to have is an 80-20 approach, where you're delivering the things that 80% of the people want to use, and that's likely to be 20% of the overall list of things. And so you're going to get something which is cheaper, generally speaking, certainly simpler, and much easier therefore to implement. It's not going to take as long to implement, etc. Now you're balancing here against the support issue we talked about before, but the support issue, I didn't say you had to do everything for everybody. I just said you had to meet the general requirements of everybody. And therefore a really good way of handling this is to do Moscow. So it's an agile term. It means you define a list of requirements, and you say you must have, you should have, you could have, you won't have, and you identify it like that. And when we see tender documentation or customers coming to us, or potential customers coming to us with a Moscow list, it says, there is that full list of functionality, and it says these are things we must have, these are the things that everybody sort of agrees are essential, these are the things we should have, these are things we could have, and these things we won't have, and they'll score and judge it based on that sort of analysis, and that gives you a much better result. And then you will come out generally with something that's fit for purpose, rather than if you've just gone for a big shopping list, you'll come out with something that's over-engineered and too expensive for what you really want. Yes, it's still a work shoe, but it's not for the sort of exactly the sort of work that you're dealing with. It's a very specialist work shoe. So let's just run through that as a checklist then. So maturity, we talked about appropriate fit and room for growth if you're at a low maturity level. If you're at a high maturity level, you don't need to think about room for growth. Support, so it needs to be good for all the stakeholders, in particular the management team, the people that are investing, and the funds, and the users, the people that are investing the perspiration. Time, so pilot it if you absolutely can. You'll get a much better result in terms of implementing it, but that's going to take longer, and you need to recognize that the bigger system change that you're making, the bigger sort of maturity leap you're making, that's going to take you longer to implement. And approach, so shopping lists lead to complexity, cost, and probably delay as well, so should be avoided if at all possible. If you have to do them, then use a Moscow approach, and you'll get a much better result out of the end. Okay, that's the end of the session. I hope you found that useful. If you've got any further questions, do let us know.